Hi there. Thank you for joining us for this segment. In this segment, I'm going to talk about the deeper dive into what we've called the risk-free prototype. So in the previous video, I did a quick introduction into the risk-free prototype. And if you haven't seen that video, you might want to just pop over there. In that video, we talk about just a quick overview of the risk-free prototype concept, why we do it. And then we also talk a lot about the value of building momentum and creating a meeting rhythm or a meeting cadence. Let me just touch on a couple of more detailed ideas on why we have positioned and why we leverage the risk-free prototype. The number one reason for the risk-free prototype is baked into the name, and that is to help our clients reduce risk. For many, many years, I've been on implementation teams where clients had spent, even before they started the implementation, they were asked to commit and or spend money on Salesforce licenses. And then they were paying hourly, or a pretty significant amount of their resources were going into they actually paid consultants. And what we have found is that by using a lot of the techniques that we've used in sort of traditional implementations, if we can do those same techniques in ways that enable the client to actually see what the process is going to look like and what the solution will look like before they commit to, in some cases, $2,000 per user for licenses, and in some cases, $2,000 per user per year for consulting. So the idea, if you're a 100-user implementation and you're already spending $400,000 and you're not exactly sure what problems you're going to solve, or you're not exactly sure how you're going to do it, that's a pretty significant risk for a lot of clients. So our whole idea is about how we minimize the risk. The other thing we're also doing is we're increasing the success. So rather than tying all of those funds up at the beginning of the project before you see results, you can actually tie those funds up and use that to allow for people's time to participate in the project. So in addition to reducing risk, we're also dramatically increasing the success of the project, thereby sort of developing a double benefit, which is less risk, more success. And the final reason is that, and just to be blunt, it helps us build a relationship with our client. And it also helps us determine if a client's going to be a good fit for us. There's specific things that clients need to do when they're participating in a risk-free prototype. And if they're unwilling to do those things, whether it's with us or with somebody else, then usually that means they're actually not ready to implement CRM. And so it's a real good indicator of not only the readiness of the organization, but it's a great opportunity for us to build a relationship. Now, how do we do the risk-free prototype? Well, as I said at the beginning, and as I said in the other video, the idea is to actually build the solution. Now, there might be things that we do after we shift from risk-free prototype into implementation. And so we may not cover everything in the risk-free prototype, but some of the things we will definitely cover is we will definitely cover the basic design, the basic data model. We will import real data, if not all of the data, into the risk-free prototype. And the idea is that your users will actually get to use the system. Now, I'll talk about training in another video, but one of the key things we're looking for in CRM, and Salesforce in particular, is we want to drive behavior. And the traditional model is we use reports to see if people were doing what they're supposed to, and I'll talk about that in other videos. But really what we're doing nowadays is we're really focusing on identifying ways to equip our users to be more successful. And how do we give them information that tells them that they're being more successful? So how do we use metrics and dashboards and other tools to drive a particular behavior? Well, in addition to using those tools to drive behavior, we're also using training to reinforce the right way or the best way to do things. So during the risk-free prototype, we're actually building not only the solution, but we're beginning to identify and create some of the training tools and content that'll actually be used in the Go Live system. Now, I just said Go Live system, and that may be a little confusing because it suggests that there's two systems. There isn't. The system that we start working with, what we call the trial system, that is the same Salesforce org that will eventually become the production org. So the beauty of the risk-free prototype is you're actually starting the project, you're building momentum, and you're doing that in the same exact place that you will actually go live in. And so there's just a tremendous amount of synergy and benefits that get built with that. So let's take a quick minute and talk about kind of three details of the risk-free prototype process and what we're actually doing and how we're solving problems. So the first key element of the risk-free prototype is the data. Now, the technique that I recommend clients use, and we have another video that'll talk about what we call the project doc. And so I don't want to get bogged down in that just in this video, but in that video, we talk about the Excel sheet or the Google Doc that we'll be using to sort of manage the project and identify decisions that we've made, et cetera. Well, part of that document are tabs that include identifying our data. So before we get bogged down in the document, the thing I want to say about data is that what I recommend to clients when they start the risk-free prototype, what I call the RFP, send us everything you got. That's the reason we sent you the NDA in the first email. If you haven't signed that yet and you're ready to get started, please sign that. But send us all the data that you have, whether it's demographic data like accounts and contacts with email addresses, or it's transactional data like product sales, by account, so data that you might pull from your ERP. Send us as much data as you can, and we will begin to use that to create what we call the data model. And the data model is basically, these are the fields on each screen that we want to capture or that we want to populate from other systems. And then the data model then leads into what we call the workflow, which is how will we use that data? Will we have certain users capturing that data? Will we provide data and metrics and calculations that tell people, for example, how healthy relationships are, et cetera? So the workflow is what comes after the data model. So in addition to sending us all your data, if you have any workflow documentation, process documents, Word documents that describe various business procedures or policies or whatever, we also at some point want to see those. Now, the goal here is not to bog you down in a bunch of document collection. The goal is to give you some clarity on what's useful. So data is definitely useful, and it's useful for a couple reasons. One, it not only tells us what you have and how clean or how dirty it is, but in a lot of cases, it also tells us the kind of things that you want to know or that you already know about your contacts and your accounts. So it starts to tell us about the data model again. And then finally, what we do with the data and any of that workflow documentation is we begin to develop a sense of what the actual user interface will look like. And as I said a minute ago, sometimes you're populating data from other systems and sometimes you're asking users to populate that. Well, you want to pay real close attention to your user experience depending on those different requirements. If we're populating data from other systems, we may be a little bit more open with how we bring data in. So let me talk a little bit about how we actually get started. So the first thing we're going to do is create what we call the trial Salesforce org. And the cool thing about the trial Salesforce org is, as I said earlier, that becomes your actual production org. So this will be the org that you end up buying. Then what we'll start doing based on the data that you've sent over is we'll start creating the fields in Salesforce to receive the data, whether it's from the spreadsheets or data that we want people to capture. So that's, I've referred to that earlier as the data model, but that's where we actually start to create the fields. At some point, we'll actually go through the data, import some of that data or all of it. And if, for example, you're sending data other than transactional data, this is where I get excited. So if you're sending, data other than demographic data, if you're sending transactional data like invoices and sales information, initially we'll import that in and lay the foundation for actually integrating with the ERP later. But the idea is then you could begin to actually see what it would look like if I were able to go in and see what a client's buying or what their purchasing trends are, et cetera. So that'll all be part of that risk-free prototype like we talked about. And finally, during this process, we start to document all of our decisions in the design document or that project document. So if we make decisions about process or decisions about fields or reports, or different metrics that we want to use, all of that gets documented and captured in the project doc that you will be sharing with us, or we will be sharing with you. So finally, let's talk about next steps. If you haven't started the risk-free prototype and you feel like you're ready, next step is number one, sign the NDA and go ahead and schedule a phone call with me, and we'll do what we call kind of sort of the kickoff call. In that call, we'll kind of figure out a day of the week that works best to set up our weekly meetings. We'll nail down the scheduling, who's going to be there. We'll get all those meeting requests done. We'll talk about data. We'll talk about what you have available, where you might have some issues, and we'll get the process started. And finally, if you're not ready to do that yet, like I said in the previous video, you've got the project document in the initial email. You can start to do some of this work internally. What I recommend, as I said earlier, is start that weekly meeting internally. Pick a day and a time, do it via GoToMeeting, do it via Zoom, do it face-to-face, but go ahead and start. And I can give you some guidance in an additional phone call, but there's plenty of guidance in these videos on where to start and how to start with that. So again, start with your data, start with kind of your workflows, and start to lay out that data model. So again, thank you for taking a few minutes to watch this. If you have some time and you want to get on my calendar, please do so. If not, go ahead and schedule that meeting internally, and let's get started. Thank you.